do want to just talk about a little bit about COVID. And in your book, in How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, you use COVID as a mechanism to kind of help people understand how serious climate change is, that by mid-century, it could be just as deadly as COVID, and by 2100, 5 times as deadly. What lessons do you think we can learn from COVID that would be applicable to dealing successfully with climate change?
Well, the pandemic is a great example where we count on the government to have expertise and to prepare us even for unlikely events. Certainly because we have earthquakes, the government has building codes to minimize the damage and the deaths. They've got FEMA that can step in there. For the pandemic, despite myself and others as far back as 2015 highlighting this as a huge problem that we weren't already for, the right steps were not taken. And then even as the pandemic came upon us, some of that CDC expertise wasn't used. So we'll be looking back at what we should have done differently. And I think this time, because of the trillions in dollars of cost and huge human misery that doesn't even get into that economic figure, that we will make those investments, and that that will be great. Climate is very similar, except sadly with climate, once you get into the problem, the coral reefs dying off, the Arctic ice being gone, you can't reverse those things just by inventing one thing. With the pandemic, thank goodness, the pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer on its own, the others with some U.S. help, did come up with the vaccines that now we can see, the end is in sight, even with the variants slowing things down. With climate, it won't just be one breakthrough like that. And if you let it start to happen, the instability, the die-off levels will be way beyond the problems that we've had here with the pandemic.
Where do you think we are in this pandemic? I interviewed President Biden just the other day. He was saying he thinks by end of July, there'll be enough vaccines available for anybody who wants one. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be in people's arms by then, but they'll be out there, they'll be available. And by December of next year, we'll be back to normal. Though I talked to Fauci after that, who sort of said depends how you define normal. Where do you see it? When do you think normal, a semblance of normal returns? And do you think that end of July figure for the vaccines is right?
Yeah. So the supply side on the vaccines is a very positive picture, because not only do we have Pfizer and Moderna upping their capacity, we have also Johnson & Johnson and Novavax that have proven to be very effective are coming along, and there will be U.S. factories. So that'll join in meeting that U.S. demand. So having the supply side in great shape by July, I think that's very likely. The logistics that have been limiting, that varies state by state, but I think the lessons of the states who did it well, if we had to do it all over again, the CDC should have had the clear website to organize things, but it's too late to start that over. So the logistics, could push things out a month or two. The variants may mean that even people like myself who are lucky enough to have been vaccinated, we may get a booster dose that's adapted to those, and so there'll be some logistics around that. But the true limiting factor may be the demand. How many people are open-minded as they see that there's very, very little in the way of side effects, and that you're protecting your fellow citizens. I've seen some numbers on this for various groups like the military or people of color that have me worried that we won't get up to a herd immunity level, and that we need to communicate and create that trust.
I was in Milwaukee doing this town hall with the president. I was looking at the figures in Milwaukee, and this is just off the top of my head, but I think among white residents in Milwaukee, about 9% had been vaccinated. Among black residents, I think it was around 3.3%, which is startling that that difference.
Yeah, and it should be the opposite because we've seen for a variety of factors that we don't totally understand that blacks are more susceptible to get infected and even to die. And so we should be going after the people of color and building up their trust and acceptance and ease of accessing the vaccine in a very special way. So we've fallen short again, but I think some special actions need to be put into place in terms of speaking somebody who has the trust of those communities, talking about why they took the vaccine and why it's helpful to the entire community.
A year from now, would you go have dinner outside in a restaurant or inside in a restaurant in Seattle? Would you still be wearing a mask? Would you shake hands with people a year from now?
I'll follow whatever the conventions are. If you're not around someone who is unvaccinated and at high risk, either because they're old or medical conditions of getting the disease, we will be able to back off on some of these practices. If you're out where it's strangers and one of them may be an older person who's not vaccinated, you should wear a mask and you should distance because there's still going to be a risk that even when you're vaccinated that you can transmit to that other person.
Do you think you would go back to shaking hands? I mean, ever? Is that just one of those things that in the future we're always going to be carrying masks around? We're not going to have the sort of, that this will always be out there.
Well, it's interesting, flu is at a record low because of the things we've done to reduce coronavirus spread. And flu on an average year, was still killing 60,000 people despite having a vaccine and some prior immunity. And so whether people now say, gosh, it wasn't that valuable to shake hands, so let's give that up, I'll follow the social convention. I won't, be an outlier one way or the other on that.
If everyone's shaking hands, you'll shake hands. Okay, I got it.
Just to show my, I always think about technological innovation before other things. I'm hoping we can come up in the next decade with a vaccine that is universal to all coronaviruses, not just this one. And likewise, a vaccine that's universal to all flus, because there are negative effects even from the coronavirus colds that people get. And the flu, we know that particularly in pregnant women, and I mentioned the 60,000 deaths. And so I hope the medical community gets super ambitious on diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines to particularly get rid of a lot of respiratory disease because it's got a yearly burden as well as the pandemic risk.